Hey, good afternoon. My name's Mike. I know some of you have seen some of my videos before on either TikTok, YouTube, or Instagram under Chili Dog Pilot. But one of the things I've not done up until now is really spend a lot of time talking to the camera or to the audience or explaining what I'm doing from a flying perspective. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about myself and my flying background. I am a private pilot with an instrument rating. I started flying in 1990 and have been flying on and off since then until now. Short-term goals for myself is probably in the next year or two, when work permits, I would like to pursue my commercial rating, and then sometime after that start working on my CFI. So as I mentioned, I've been flying a while. I, like I said, started learning back in 1990, so here's kind of my pathway into flying. High school, I was growing up in Mesa, Arizona. It was my junior year. We were hosting German exchange students, so I was hosting one. So one of my classmates who was also hosting a German exchange student was having a get-together and barbecue at her house for all the hosts and German students that were staying with us. While we were there, we were kind of just chatting about what our future goals were, as you would kind of do in high school. And I had mentioned that my goal was to eventually become a military pilot, and that flying was very important to me. It just so happened that the father of this girl was a CFI. He was a professional pilot. He did a lot of Grand Canyon tours and things of that nature, and started asking me more about my interest in flying, and wanted to know if that's something I wanted to do before I graduated high school. Obviously, I was very interested in that, and so we began talking about that possibility. And looking back, it was an amazing offer because what he had offered me was he owned a Beechcraft Musketeer, and he basically said for $2,500 he would teach me how to fly and get my private license. And then if for some reason after 45 hours I did not get my license, I think he was charging me like 40 or 50 bucks an hour beyond that until I was able to accomplish that. So basically my first flight was in June of 1990, and worked on my private pilot license. So learning back in 1990 was a lot different than it is today. So for example, in that Beechcraft Musketeer, it was very comparable to what I would say is like probably a Piper Cherokee. I think this one had, I can't remember if it had 160 or 180 horsepower, but it was a small 4-seat airplane, well built, being that it was a Beechcraft aircraft. But as far as avionics go, it was standard 6-pack, so vacuum system driven 6-pack. Back then there was no GPS or moving map, so everything we did was based on pilotage, dead reckoning, and or VOR navigation. And we didn't have ForeFlight, so everything was, basically all calculations were done on pen and paper. If you were lucky, at some point I think I got for a gift a electronic E6B calculator, but otherwise it was the old spin wheel to calculate all those course corrections and whatnot for flight planning. I know back in that time, Loran was a capability or a functionality that they had for RNAV navigation. I do not think they had moving maps though. I think it was all based on coordinates that you could then transpose into location finding. So I got my private license in November of that year and flew off and on through the rest of my senior year until I graduated high school and then went on to the US Naval Academy. So after getting into the Naval Academy, I pretty much stopped my flying. I was probably just under 100 hours at that point in time. My goal was to become a military pilot in the Navy. Unfortunately, that did not happen for my graduating class, and kind of around that time period, which was mid-90s, they wanted all military pilots, or at least all naval pilots, to have 20/20 uncorrected vision. So I was deemed as not physically qualified to be a fighter pilot. So instead, I took on another venture to serve out my time that I owed to the military. And at that point in time, having come from an Army family, I actually selected to inter-service transfer to the U.S. Army and be an infantry officer. So I spent about close to 7 years on active duty. So I did not get back into flying again until about 2004. My wife was very aware of my passion of flying and decided to give me a gift of 10 hours of flight lessons at our local airport. We settled outside of Philadelphia once I left the military, and so she found a school that was a kind of a mom and pop flight school out of Trenton Mercer, and was able to get back into flying doing that. this school still had older Cessna 172s, so it was my first time flying Cessnas. I think early on with the Beechcraft, I kind of fell in love with the low-wing airplane. The Cessnas, I think were just fine airplanes. These were, again, more vintage airplanes. They were probably from the mid-'70s, so by and large, they were kind of equipped similarly to, what I flew in, which was, straight VORs and a steam six-pack. I would say the flying, getting back into it with, going into this point, I probably had between 80 and 100 hours, so not a lot of flying time and a long gap in between. So it took me, probably close to all of that 10 hours to really just get back and to hone my skills as a pilot. I think the approaches to landing was probably one of the more difficult things for me to get back into. Because it took me a while to get that good sight picture of the approach to landing and really understanding height above ground and like when to best execute the flare to touchdown. So I recall that being probably 2 or 3 hours before I got really settled into that. I think I mentioned, before that Beechcraft Musketeer was offering the plane to me for $45 an hour. So aircraft rental grew drastically over that time. I think in the Philadelphia area, by and large, a 4-seat single-engine prop, fixed gear prop, was running about 100 to 125 an hour. That was more than a doubling of what I was used to paying when I first learned to fly. So having to build that into a budget now with being married, having one kid, and potentially another kid on the way, definitely kind of slowed down my ability to fly quite a bit. I was able to work on my instrument rating, and so that took me about 9 months of just trying to work time in to fly in between work and other commitments. And then after I got my instrument rating, I also got my high performance rating because one of the gifts to myself was to get myself into the Lance, and since I already had the complex, the only additional thing I had to do was get the high performance time. So that's kind of got me up to close to 300 hours, and at that point in time, we're looking at 2009, work and then family just made it become really difficult to fly. I also had a job where I was traveling, 80% of the time. So I decided it was time to kind of focus on young kids and work, and I ended up just taking a break from flying. And so that was my second break in aviation for myself. And I did not get back into flying again until about 3 years ago, back in 2022. Okay, so 2022 comes along. I decided that financially we were in a place that I could afford flying and it not being a burden on the family. My daughter was a senior in college. My son was a senior in high school. And I think just with their lives and everything else going, and with work, it was a good time for me to get back into flying. And so that was a decision I made, after discussing it with my wife. So coming back into flying after probably another 13, almost 14 years, a lot of changes have happened in that time period. One of the things I did was I invested in a computer and purchased the latest version of Microsoft Flight Simulator. I heard a lot of good things about it, as well as using it in virtual reality. And I would say, I contribute part of my getting back into flying, or my ease of getting back into flying, to that. I think also just having had my instrument rating and, a couple hundred hours under my belt at that point in time also helped accelerated it. But compared to when I went back after a break back in early 2000, when it took me probably about close to 10 hours to just be comfortable flying VFR, I would say in under an hour, I was pretty good with flying the airplane. I think even my first flight when I was accepted back into the club, I did pretty well on everything except maybe the landings. And the landings were decent. They just weren't great. Whereas, as I mentioned in my previous break, it took me probably 2 or 3 lessons to get landings back. From a standpoint of getting back into the saddle, I think it took me probably 2 to 3 hours to where I was landing the plane as good as I ever had, if not even better. So I think the recall was much better the second time around. Where there was probably a little bit longer delay in getting back into the scheme of things was on the instrument flying. I think one part, it was the actual flying itself. I think the pace of flying and all the other things that go with it, being ahead of the airplane, communicating with ATC, that probably took 2 or 3 hours as well. But I found, so I think it was a good lesson for me. One, in experience does help quite a bit, and second part is proficiency and currency are always very important. So I try to get a lot of the flying done on the weekends when I don't have work. Sometimes I'll do it in the week, either early in the morning before I start or at the end of the day. But on average, I try to get 2 or 3 hours a weekend. If I could do more, that's great. At one point I was probably averaging 15 hours or so a month. But anyways, that's kind of my background in flying and where I'm at today. And like I said, I want to continue to share more, like what that format will look like. I think it's to be determined. I'm going to kind of just play it by ear. But thank you. Please hit subscribe, and we'll talk again soon.